Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Michael Woodward, who is a clinical assistant professor of executive education at NYU, where he leads the Masters of Science program in executive coaching and organizational consulting. As a consultant and professional coach, Dr. Woody works with both private and corporate clients on building management and leadership capacity. He is also author of the Amazon top-selling book, The U Plan, a 5-step guide to taking charge of your career in the new economy. Dr. Woody also has published award-winning research on teams and teamwork titled Cooperation and Competition, the Effects of Team Entrainment and Reward Structure. Welcome to the program, Woody.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Charles.
So I'd like to start with just having our listeners learn more about you. So love to hear more about your background and really what got you interested into coaching.
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally an organizational psychologist by training. Did my undergrad in psychology, my master's in counseling and psychological services, then a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. So that's a lot of psychology, but did all that stuff. And in between there, I did a stint at PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM Global Business Services in our HR consulting business, doing a lot of work around HR transformation and then kind of morphed into some leadership development, leadership advisory work. And yeah, while I was in grad school, I just really was interested in how to make the human experience of work better. That's always been my passion. That's always been my interest. And there are so many ways to go about doing that. And so I started to really narrow in on, well, how do I help leaders at all levels work through others more effectively and more empathetically, to be quite frank. And so I found that was a great way to have a big impact on the workplace, is working with those who seem to have the most influence, even if it's at a leader of a team level or a department level, not just at the higher echelons of leadership. So that's where I got some interest in that. And when I was doing my PhD, I was doing some work on my own with 2 different companies when I was living down in South Florida. And roughly within a few months of each other, the senior leaders at both companies approached me with a similar challenge, which was, so I have this individual and we're struggling with them as a new leader or as an experienced leader taking on a bigger role. Not always the ideal way to get into coaching because it's a little remedial at that point, but it was a really great opportunity. And so from there, I got really interested in how do I help these individuals understand the psychology of working through others and the psychology of self-reflection and self-insight, and how to make those connections and influence action. And so that's where my journey really got started, like 20 years ago, something like that, in that space. And then it evolved over time to where I am now at this point in my career, which is very, very different than where I started out and not at all where I expected to be quite frank.
But it's the first master's program that really specializes in executive coaching, right? That you've helped to develop and you're leading at NYU, right?
Yeah. So it's always these serendipitous conversations, right? If you remember pre-pandemic, when we actually went to conferences and events and those things and weren't afraid to be near people, I was at an event, it was like 2018, I think, an event in Baltimore. And I was standing in line behind this woman and we got to chatting. We were waiting for this dinner event and she ran the portfolio of human capital programs at New York University. And so as we were chatting, she said, we're trying to get approval for a Master of Science degree in executive coaching and organizational consulting. And I said, well, congratulations, good and good luck. It's just, kind of the response in these sort of flyby conversations. But what happened was I stayed in touch with her and we kept in contact. And as they got more serious about it and got approvals from the university and from the state of New York, they asked me to throw my hat in the ring. And I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to come in and build out the first Master of Science program in executive coaching at a major university in the US. So we built it out in 2020. I was hired in January of 2020. We all know what happened then. I had a great office location for about 5 minutes and a beautiful dream that seemed to be dissipating fast, but we powered through. And fortunately, just like what you guys have done with IMS, I mean, you made a hard pivot to figuring out how to be virtual and be very, very effective, by the way. And so we did that as well. We launched fully remote with 32 students, which was more than double what we had hoped with given the circumstances. And so now I'm excited to say that we're on our third cohort of Master of Science students, and it has been a really exciting journey. We launched a global summit back in June of this year. We brought together leaders from most of the major coaching platforms and a lot of researchers from around the globe to talk about the digital revolution in coaching. So we have a publication coming out next year. So we've done a lot in a very short period of time, and we've had huge impact. And I can honestly tell you, it's been one of the most exciting career opportunities and the most exciting work I've ever done in my life is being a professor at NYU. So we love it. I love it.
Well, congratulations. So what an accomplishment. I'm sure you've learned a lot that we'll try to unpack some of during our conversation here today. First, I'd love for you to distinguish for our listeners the difference between coaching, mentoring, managing others, and even therapy, because those terms, they're really not synonyms, even though they are related.
Yeah, it's a great question, Charles, because I think people sometimes think of them a little too interchangeably, and they're really not. One of the things that I've been very focused on, and we've focused on at NYU, is really how do we continue to professionalize the field of executive coaching, business coaching, management, workplace coaching, whatever you want to call it. It's roughly all within the same family, right, of coaching activities and interventions. And so, in fairness, a lot of the coaching and the coaching work that I do and the coach education and training that we do has evolved from many places. One of those would be the fields of counseling and psychotherapy. No question about it. We are very heavily rooted in psychology and a lot that we've learned from psychology. That said, coaching is not therapy. Coaching is not licensed counseling, right? That is its own distinct field. It is a field very much looking at mental health, mental wellness, even into clinical disorders and other challenges that would be covered by HIPAA and other legal regulations. So that's not what a coach is there to do, is but we are very forward-looking in looking at issues and challenges you may be facing in the workplace or in your work life now that we could address and work on and think about how do we develop those forward, right? So that you can improve those behaviors. Typically, it's enhancing performance in some way, which involves behavior change, or it's adjusting, rethinking how you communicate in some way, shape, or form to be more effective in how you work through others or communicate to others. So that tends to be where our emphasis is. You also mentioned mentoring. Mentoring is a very informal relationship where you often have kind of a power dynamic, sort of a seasoned, older professional with more experience, helping someone younger navigate politics or industry nuances or how to navigate working in an organization, things like that. Those tend to be not really professionally engaged relationships. It's more informal, but sometimes companies will have formal mentoring programs where they'll match you with folks, but it's not really designed as professional coaching for enhancing performance and communication over time. Those tend to be more casual relationships.
Thank you for providing that distinction. And you mentioned something that I'd like to go into and distinguish between these two as well, as coaching for performance versus coaching for development. Is there a difference? And if so, what are the differences?
Sure. It depends on what you mean by performance, right? So oftentimes when I hear the word performance, what I hear is performance problem or lack of performance or something like that, right? When you talk to HR folks. And so if you're trying to aid someone in addressing a performance issue or challenge, or someone who may be on a PIP, a performance improvement program, right? That's very different. Often it can be a little bit remedial. I think coaching there, can it be effective? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. Because is the individual you're coaching, the coachee, are they really aligned? Are they there because they want to be, or have they been voluntold, so to speak, right? If I don't get coaching, I don't do this, I'm probably going to be in trouble. Not ideal, to be quite frank. And I think it's better to coach to develop, as you put it, at earlier stages is help people in a transition phase, which is where I've spent a lot of my time, where they might need help adjusting to a new role, particularly if they're going into a role that involves leading other people in a way they haven't done before, or leading their former peers in a way that may feel awkward and uncomfortable because those peers might have lost out on that same job they were going for, or just because they're going to see them a bit differently, right? The nature of the relationship will change. So those are things to watch out for. So yes, coaching performance is not uncommon. It's not an ideal place because it means it's gone too far and now you're trying to coach them back. My preference is, how do you intervene earlier and coach people to develop into roles, particularly because the challenges they're going to deal with are very predictable. We know this. We know they're going to go through trying to lead people, trying to lead former peers, trying to take on that role of getting away from doing it yourself and doing it through others. Very, very, very predictable. So that's where we like to spend our time.
That's a great distinction, because you're right. The coaching for development is more proactive, addressing these problems before they are likely to exist, whereas coaching for performance is reactive, right? You're dealing with performance issues that are usually not positive, and you're trying to get them back on course. So thank you for providing that distinction. Now, since you have that role at NYU and you've had this summit, this coaching summit recently, you're in a great position to kind of talk about more about this topic. And really, I get this from a lot of leaders, is that the coaching industry is in a state of upheaval, a lot of disruptions going on in the industry. You have these huge digital coaching platforms that are coming in, and then you have those traditional executive coaching companies that are still there trying to identify their niche in the market. If you could give us a landscape of where you see the coaching industry right now, and maybe in 6 months to a year, where is it going?
Yeah, so I might make a bit of a different distinction here. I would say the coaching industry is in a mass acceleration and a revolution, even an evolution forward, that I think is incredibly exciting and positive. I would say L&D, so learning and development, may be experiencing some upheaval and disruption due to this new digital coaching revolution, where you're seeing this mass digital transformation, where these major technology players in the digital coaching space have emerged out of the pandemic. But a lot of what they're doing is they are coming at, I think, the L&D space, really the outside provider space, consulting firms, in a bit of a sideways approach that they probably didn't expect, and it's really catching on. When it comes to digital coaching platforms or digital transformation, so what we saw during the pandemic or during COVID were a lot of people working remotely, right? Particularly in white collar jobs, knowledge worker jobs. And so you had teams dispersed, you had people dealing with the transition of being at home, the transition of having kids at home, anyone who went through that, elderly parents possibly that you're taking care of, a lot of adjustments, right? And so what happened was leaders were more disconnected from their people in ways that they had never been used to experiencing. People were also experiencing depression, boredom, confusion, isolation, right? And so all this necessitated the need for help in some way. Some of it rose to the needs of mental health providers, but a lot of it was just, how do I adjust working in isolation, working under stress, working under all this ambiguity? And so these coaching platforms existed. They were already there. It was a matter of figuring out how to best deploy these services across the board, not just to struggling leaders, but just to anyone struggling working at home. So I describe them kind of like, if you think of an employee assistance program, really there for mental, physical health issues, it's sort of like an EAP light, right? Like the 311 to the 911 number, where it's more like, I'm just struggling to rethink my work life, my routines, my shifts and days, how I just function in this new way, because it was just such an upheaval. So that's where these firms really started to shine, because they were providing these great services, because they had networks of independent contractor coaches around the world that could really be available on demand. And that's what these providers really demonstrated, their ability to get people access to coaches on demand as needed, with all sorts of different types of specialties that could be helpful in these circumstances that people were going through working from home.
So when we get into coaching, and everyone coaches. I mean, it's peer-to-peer coaching. You see coaching up, you see coaching down. So leaders that state, they really don't need to know this. I find them very rare. Everyone wants to know how to coach better. It's an important part of their job, their role, that they're finding that's more important over time. But when you see a lot of new leaders coming into this, and even mid-level leaders or rather seasoned leaders, they're not very effective with this coaching approach on the steps to take to start out to say, okay, here's having it more structured possibly. So if you could give some insight around the fact that I've always thought coaching is designed to empower the individual to self-discover, right? At its best, I see the coachee go from self-discovery to a willingness to problem solve. And that's far more powerful than having the coach kind of walking them through it and not allowing that self-discovery process to happen. Is that a fairly accurate statement about where they should be in the coaching process or the intent of coaching?
Yeah, Charles, I think you stated very well. And here's something I'll add, because there's a distinction I like to make that I think is helpful. In the coaching industry, and certainly in coach education, we refer to big C coaching versus small C coaching. Big C coaching is really the process of coaching, right? So it's that structured process that you go through. So as an example, as a big C coach, this is what a professional coach would do. They would probably conduct some form of a needs assessment around the individual. What kind of coaching do they need? They would talk to the multiple parties involved, because it's important to remember coaching is rarely a two-party relationship. It's typically a three-party or more. There's the sponsor, the organization, so your CHRO, your executive, your leader bringing you in, the coach, and then the coachee, right? So there's some needs assessment done with the three parties. There's an agreement. So we agree on, what is my role as a coach? What are you looking for from me? And let me help you understand what a coach does versus, as you mentioned before, a psychotherapist or a mentor or even a leader. And then you do some sort of level of evaluation on the individual, maybe a 360, a personality assessment of some time to get additional data. You provide them feedback on what you hear. You get some of their insight, understand the kind of vision that they see for themselves. What does that positive future state look like? You co-create some sort of plan as you go through these steps over probably 6 months to a year's time, typically. You are there to be an accountability partner as well as a sounding board, but ultimately really a thought partner to help them think through. And as you said, empower them to take the steps to go take action and ultimately take that learning and apply it back to their place of work or to whatever it is they're doing, right? So that's the big C. That's what a professional coach does. From a small C perspective, this is about deploying different coaching techniques or simple models in how you might manage a conversation with someone, particularly if you're trying to plan something or help them discover some sort of insight or action to take forward or just noodle something out in their mind, right? And there are lots of ways to do that as well. And this is where a leader is really not going to be a big C coach, because a leader, you have a lot more responsibility for that individual. You also have authority, right? There's a power dynamic as well. So there are a lot of things to consider, but as a leader, small C things, you can just help them figure out how to, like you said, develop solutions, identify challenges, be aware of how they act and interact with others, and how to take positive steps forward, monitor that progress forward, and deliver some kind of result. And along the way, hopefully reflect and learn as they go. So, I mean, that's the small C versus the big C, if that makes sense.
No, that's great. And I love in your programs and your approach that really you simplify it down to two things that coaches do effectively. They actively listen and they thoughtfully ask. And many people don't feel like coaching maybe is that listening part, but that's so important to gather that information, to be active and empathetically listening, so you really can understand their needs, their challenges, their outcomes that they're hoping to get, and then ask the right questions. So let's first go into some of the challenges with listening and maybe some tips you can provide our listeners on how to become better listeners during these coaching conversations.
Yeah, one of the things that, Charles, is such a great point you bring up about listening. When I train students, they always ask about asking questions and those powerful questions to evoke that insight. And what I always say is questions should come from listening. You should always listen first and be present and be there with the coachee. Hear what they're saying, reflect some of it back, right? Dig in, ask further questions, ask clarifying questions, ask definitional questions, right? Dig in to what they're telling you, right? If you're spending more than 30% of your time talking as a coach, you're not coaching. You're dictating and you're telling. And there are coaches, and there's software I've used where we track this in training folks where they can speak anywhere from 40 to 60% of the time. It's like, what are you doing if you're doing all the talking? You're not really hearing them and reflecting back what they're saying. So there are a lot of great techniques to use to very actively listen. But first, you should always listen with as many of your senses as you possibly can. So in an interaction like this on video, I can see you, right? I can see your body language. I can see where your eyes look. I can see background and space and things that are signals, right? I certainly can hear you. Sometimes there's some energy that can come across online, not as great as in person. But in those in-person interactions, you do get that feel of energy and smell and everything around you. I mean, so there are a lot of things you want to really deploy all your senses to get as rich of an understanding of what the individual is signaling and saying to you through everything they do, not just the words that they're using. So that's the first thing, I think, is be as attentive as you can.
I like that. I also have noticed too that a lot of times leaders, coaches, they ask multiple questions. So it's really being careful to ask one question at a time and then pausing and being silent and waiting for that answer, right? Not having that tendency just to step in and direct the conversation based on where you think it might be going.
Yeah, it's tempting to want to be a driver and to drive an agenda. And one of the most important things you can do is give people time. I learned this early in my career where I'm a pretty social guy. I can, have that desire, that drive to want to fill space. Sometimes you need to give someone a moment to think and allow them to think instead of filling it with another question, or as you mentioned, question stacking, right? Where they get to the point where they don't remember the first question because you've hit them with 4 or 5 in a row. And instead of question stacking, what you want to do is clarifications. Often the first answer they give you is going to be that superficial answer they've given countless times before, and it's not really thought out. So ask them a clarifier again. Ask them to elaborate. I'm a big believer in asking people to define what they mean by the terms they use, because oftentimes they haven't thought a lot about what they mean by what they're saying. And it's helpful to do that, to get them to define terms, to clarify what they mean by something, what it looks like. Because the idea is you're getting them to think deeper about either what they've done or what they want to do or what they're hearing and seeing around them. So those are great ways to really dig in.
And it's really by listening that you can ask those poignant questions that dig deeper into those critical issues. A strategy that I've used when I'm listening to someone, especially when you have your own agenda going through your mind and you're thinking about, okay, here's what I want to say next, right, is to even take a notebook and start writing down notes so that you're more active in engaging with them, because it's not enough. And I heard this from a leader a while back. It's not enough for you to say that you are listening. They have to know that you are listening. They have to realize that through your body language, through what you've clarified, summarized, backtracked with. So it's important to really be on both levels if you want them to feel understood and that you are actively listening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Charles, that's one thing I talk to my students about, and I do myself. I am an avid note taker, and I always let them know that I'm going to be taking notes, because sometimes they see me looking away, right? And something like that. So I let them know, no, by the way, I'm actually writing down. And one of the keys that taking notes is really helpful with is if you hear something and you're not sure about it, or it could be a direction to go in, but you don't want to disrupt their train of thinking, just make a note of it and you can always come back to it. And the other thing is also, I like to make note of patterns or repeated terms or words or phrases that I hear, where I could say, by the way, you've said this 6 times in our conversation. It probably warrants a little further discussion, but I agree with you. That's a really great technique.
Let's move on then to the next one, questioning. So now that you've not rushed through the listening phase, you really have understood the issues, challenges, what they hope to get in terms of outcomes. Now you're in a better position to ask those questions. But what kind of questions should you be asking them? Are there certain types?
So I don't like to fall back on certain specific types of questions. Like I said, a lot of times the clarifying questions, the definitional questions are really helpful. I think at the outset, though, of any coaching engagement, you do want to get a sense of what their vision is for that positive future state. What does it look like? And you really want to spend time getting an understanding of what that looks like, first of all, even if it's as simple as a habit change. Okay, so what does Charles look like when he's got this new habit in his routine 3 months from now? Like, what do you look like, right? What is that vision of yourself? And how is it beneficial to you? Another type of question that's important early on is to ask about alignment. So remember, I mentioned this is a three-party relationship. So oftentimes you'll get someone, they'll say, yeah, I'm really interested in seeking out this promotion or to enhance my contributions or my sales numbers or whatever it is in the company. Or I'm building a new team and I want to get them at a certain place, get a gauge of morale. Okay. And as time goes on, sometimes you'll say, all right, so where does that align with the reason I've been brought here as a coach or as a boss? How does that, if you're asking as a leader, how does that align with the goals of the team or the department or the division, right? Do you want to make sure that the work they're working on or the changes they're working on, the communication, whatever it is aligned with the larger goal of the team or the organization so they could see where that impact will make a difference? And it's important as a coach or as a leader to make sure you're not just there for idle chit chat or to kind of brainstorm, how you're feeling about traffic today or politics, right? I mean, you want to make sure there is some level of focus. So I think alignment questions are important and vision questions are important. And you keep checking in on those because oftentimes as a coach, what will happen is someone will come to me and if I have a good relationship with them, we're, maybe 6 months into it or even longer, and they'll say, Woody, I have something very specific today I need to work on. So let's take a sidebar to the larger stuff. And hey, if it helps them be a better leader in that moment or deal with a particular issue that is part of their effectiveness as a leader, then let's do it. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, but you just want to make sure you're always aligning.
Great advice. How about for the type of question, which I kind of classify as going deeper question, when you're starting your relationship with a coaching client, you realize over time with experience that sometimes the reasons they give you initially aren't really the reasons, the underlying rationale, that you have to dig deeper to get to what is really the crux of the issue, the underlying rationale that's causing this behavior to happen. What is an effective approach to go about doing that? Or possibly if you just keep asking, okay, digging deeper and why is that, the 5 whys, or when do you stop with that approach, right? So that you've hit it on the head.
Yeah, I think if you're working with someone and it feels like they're staying at a superficial level, right? And they're not getting to why they're really experiencing the challenges they're experiencing, particularly if you're talking about obstacles to something, right? Whether they're perceived obstacles or real obstacles or somewhere in between. If you feel, so certainly like if I feel someone needs to get a little bit deeper and they're not, I'll ask them, first of all, are you comfortable with us probing a little bit more about what's going on, say in this one idiosyncratic relationship that you have with someone, because I'm sensing that there's more there that we need to figure out, right? It's not just we don't work together on certain things all that well. Well, why is that, right? And what can we do about that moving forward? What you don't want to get into is psychotherapy, though. I mean, and so, but if there's a past history or something where two people have not gotten along and they haven't addressed it, and there may be an opportunity to address it, sure, right? If you can get past it, but they have to be willing to acknowledge it first. So you can point out so much, but you have to let them know, can you help me understand what's going on here? Can we find out a little more about the history of this particular relationship that seems to be problematic or getting in the way, or seems to be something more you want to work on that you're not? Maybe it's a neutral relationship that could be more positive, right? That they need. Well, Why is that? What do you need from that relationship? And let's talk more about it, right? So there are varying ways. It's one of those, it kind of depends on the situation.
No, but that's some great advice regarding that so that people can have that script and that approach, which I think is effective in that way. So we've talked about improving your listening skills, also improving your questioning skills as well, because those are two critical aspects of being a better coach. I'd like to give our listeners before the end of the episode a simple model that they can use and start with. And it's the GROW model. It's pretty commonly known to many leaders these days, but it's an effective starting point for them, especially for new leaders. Love for you to unpack it a little bit, go through each one of the steps, and then we can maybe discuss one or two of those steps in more detail.
Yeah, sure. Probably the most popular, most well-known coaching model is the GROW model. It's super simple. It's easy to remember. And of course, grow because you want to develop someone. So let's grow them. And the first is goal. So you want to establish, what is the goal? What's the point? What's the focus, right? All motivation needs direction. So where's our goal? Where are we heading to? Then the R is the reality. What is our current situation on the ground? So what's going on? Where are we now? And let's get a feel for that, right? What assets do you have at your disposal and what challenges may you be considering? And then there's options. I like to say options or obstacles. So in the reality, you may look at obstacles, and then options, the O is, all right, what are the different approaches we can use to pursue this goal, right? To get us there. Because it's not always about one approach, and you really want to dig deep with someone because they can get stuck on one way or what I've done before, or what I've been told. So you want to think about, what are the different options or ways I can go about doing this? What does that look like? And also sometimes you may need to remove barriers because we have these self-perceived notions that I can't do this, or this person wouldn't approve that, or they won't allow it. Well, have you asked? If you haven't asked, let's explore that, right? And then the last one, so oftentimes they'll say is will. I like to say the way forward is, all right, what are you going to go do next? Because you should never leave a conversation, whether it's a coach or a leader, manager working with someone, without determining what you're going to go do next, right? So that way forward's got to be, what is it going to look like? What are the steps going to look like? Let's think about the plan, milestones, how will I gauge progress? Who can I engage as an accountability partner, right? Which could be the coach, it could be the leader, it could be a peer, right? Colleague. That's completely up to you. So you definitely want to think about that way forward. Determine that goal, try to keep it simple, straightforward. Look at the reality right now. What is your situation? Why are you not doing it, right? What challenges there may be? What are the different options forward that you could draw out and sketch? And then what's that way forward? Ask yourself the next steps that you're going to hold yourself to. And then there you go.
Is there a step in that process that's usually the most difficult when people start out?
It depends. Usually people have a goal in mind. So clarifying the goal and skinnying it down is helpful, because the reason most New Year's resolutions, the vast majority, fail is people don't really set goals, by the way. They set aspirations or ideas without a plan. So keep that in mind. That's the best test case, right? Does this sound like a New Year's resolution? Then it's probably not a goal, right? I think testing the current situation, people usually know where they are. They have a sense of their resources, what they have at their disposal. Coming up with options, because people usually don't think through more than one way of doing something, that can take a little bit of time to push somebody. But once you get through those different options and you've kind of sketched out where the challenges are, where you may get support, deciding on setting that plan forward is usually pretty straightforward. But you do have those who struggle to put plans down on paper or on text. And you really have to do that, because you can enhance attainment by 30% just by committing and writing something down and then getting someone to hold you accountable. So that is a huge, huge step. No doubt about it.
Thank you for that advice. So now if a leader has used this model, they've had some coaching experience, but they want to go further. They want to either get into the profession, take a course, get a certification. Where would you recommend them starting?
Well, first look to us at NYU. It's interesting. I have 3 retired CEOs in my program and several career pivoters who are going back to their industries as coaches. But we have a Master of Science program. We have a certificate program. I would say, and our certificate program is ICF accredited. So I would say look at the International Coaching Federation. They're probably the biggest, certainly in North America, but they are international, as the name says. They're a great association of coaches and coach trainers that you could get a lot of information from. I think it's coachingfederation.org is probably the website, but just Google International Coaching Federation. That's probably your best resource. And then, of course, find me on LinkedIn. Take a look at what we're doing at NYU, as well as a lot of other universities have coaching certificate programs as well.
Are there any books that you would recommend for people to learn more about the coaching profession or have these coaching conversations?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I conveniently have a stack right here because I've got a ton behind me. Coaching for Performance. I know I'm probably on Mirror right now, but by John Whitmore, I mentioned him. That's the famous book where he released the Grow Model. There's a book called Helping People Change by Richard Boyatzis, Ellen Van Oosten, and Melvin Smith. That's actually a really good one. And I use that in my program. Another book I use in my program is Feedback Fundamentals, an evidence-based practice for feedback by Brody Reardon. That's another a book I use in my program. And it's great for anybody, any kind of leader it's like a simple 100-page book just on the science of feedback and techniques for feedback, not just as a coach, but as a leader. The Coaching Habit, Michael Bungay-Senye, that's another popular book out there. So yeah, and there's also a great book on the surprising science of meetings for those who struggle as leaders to lead meetings, which is a pretty good one too, because I end up as a coach, I end up working a lot with people struggling on meetings.
Well, thank you so much for being on the program today, Woody. Remind our listeners once again how they can get in contact with you.
I mean, just search Dr. Woodward on LinkedIn, and of course, mmw12 at nyu.edu, another easy way to get a hold of me. And always happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much. And this concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this with your colleagues and friends or anyone else who might find this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.